Louisiana, 1847. Deep in the bayou night. The screams started at midnight. Two men, bound and bleeding, thrashed violently in a wooden cellar as dozens of water moccasins slithered across their bodies. Their muffled cries echoed through the old plantation house, while above them a woman watched through the floorboards, her face expressionless as stone. For 15 years they had used her body as their playground. Tonight, the snakes would have theirs. But how did a woman kept in chains, displayed naked before guests, and violated nightly by her enslavers, manage to turn the tables so completely? How did she collect dozens of venomous serpents without anyone noticing? And why, when she finally had her chance to run, did she choose to stay and watch them die? This is the story of Delphine and the night she fed her masters to the bayou. Not all the horrors of the past stayed in the past. And what you're about to hear proves it. If you believe this shouldn't be buried, subscribe. Now and turn on the bell so you won't miss anything. The humid Louisiana air clung to everything like a second skin that summer of 1847. Magnolia trees lined the entrance to the Beaumont plantation, their white blooms masking the rot beneath. Inside the main house, crystal chandeliers cast flickering light across walls, decorated with European paintings and stolen African artifacts. This was where Delphine had spent the last 15 years of her life, not as a field worker, but as something far worse. She stood now in the corner of the dining room, her body barely covered by the thin fabric they allowed her. At 28 years old, Delphine had learned to make her face a mask, her eyes empty windows that revealed nothing of the fire burning behind them. Around the mahogany table, 12 white men in expensive suits laughed and drank imported brandy, their voices growing louder with each glass. "Gentlemen, as promised, the evening's special entertainment," announced Marcus Beaumont, a portly man with salt and pepper hair and hands that never stopped shaking. His brother Thomas stood beside him, taller and leaner, with cold grey eyes that tracked Delphine's every movement like a hawk watching a field mouse. Before we continue, this story contains the harsh realities of enslavement that many faced. If these stories matter to you, help us share them by hitting that like button and subscribing so we can continue bringing hidden histories to light. Delphine had been 13 when slave catchers dragged her from a small cabin in Alabama where her mother had tried to hide her. The Beaumont brothers bought her at a New Orleans auction, not for field work, but because Thomas had specific tastes. For 15 years, they had paraded her before guests, forcing her to stand exposed while men examined her like livestock. At night, the brothers took turns visiting her locked room in the servants' quarters. But Delphine had learned patience. She had learned to listen when powerful men thought enslaved people couldn't understand their conversations. She had learned the layout of every room, every hidden corner of the plantation. Most importantly, she had learned about the bayou that surrounded the property, filled with creatures far more honest in their cruelty than the men who claimed to be civilized. "Notice the unusual characteristics," Thomas was saying now, pointing at Delphine as if she were a specimen in a museum. The men leaned forward, some uncomfortable, others fascinated. "We acquired her specifically because—" "I can fetch more brandy, Master Thomas," Delphine interrupted softly, her voice the perfect blend of subservience they expected. "The guests' glasses are nearly empty." Thomas frowned at the interruption but nodded. "Be quick about it." Delphine walked toward the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors, but she didn't go to the wine cellar. Instead, she slipped through the back door into the thick Louisiana night. The bayou called to her with its chorus of frogs and insects. Mosquitoes swarmed around her as she made her way to a small shed behind the smokehouse, hidden by overgrown palmetto bushes. Inside the shed, carefully arranged in wooden crates, she had stolen one by one over the past 3 months, were her instruments of revenge. Water moccasins, copperheads, and cottonmouths, dozens of them, each captured during her brief moments of freedom when she was sent to collect herbs or fetch water. She had learned Their patterns, where they sunned themselves on logs, how to approach them with a forked stick and a burlap sack. The snakes stirred as she approached, their scales catching the moonlight filtering through gaps in the wooden walls. Delphine had fed them mice and rats, kept them alive and angry. Tonight, she would give them something better. She heard footsteps approaching. Marcus's voice cut through the darkness. "Delphine, where are you, girl? Thomas wants you back inside now." Delphine's hands didn't shake as she lifted the first crate. After 15 years, fear had been burned out of her, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. What do you think drove Delphine to this point? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 3 months earlier, everything had changed for Delphine on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She had been sent to the bayou edge to collect Spanish moss for the Beaumont's wife Camille, who used it for stuffing new cushions. The spring air hung heavy, with moisture, and cypress trees rose from the murky water like ancient sentinels. Delphine moved carefully along the bank, her basket half filled with the grey strands that draped from every branch. That's when she saw the snake hunter. He was an old man, formerly enslaved, but now free through some legal loophole Delphine didn't understand. His name was Tobias, and locals said he was half crazy, living alone in a shack built on stilts deep in the swamp. He made his living catching snakes, selling their skins to merchants in New Orleans and their venom to doctors who believed it had medicinal properties. "Girl, you best step back," Tobias called out, his voice rough as tree bark. "Big cottonmouth right there by your foot." Delphine looked down and saw it, thick as her wrist, coiled in the mud. She didn't scream or jump. Instead, she watched as Tobias approached with a long forked stick and a canvas bag. His movements were efficient, practiced. Within seconds, he had pinned the snake's head, grabbed it behind the skull, and dropped it into his bag. "You didn't run," Tobias observed, studying her with rheumy eyes. "Most folks do." "I've seen worse than snakes," Delphine replied quietly. Something in her voice made the old man pause. He looked at her more carefully, taking in the thin fabric she wore, the bruises barely visible on her dark skin, the way she held herself like someone expecting a blow at any moment. "Beaumont Plantation," he said. It wasn't a question. Delphine nodded. "I knew your mama," Tobias said suddenly. "Before they took you, she asked me to watch for you if ever I saw you, said you had her same gift with animals, could gentle the wildest creatures." Tears burned in Delphine's eyes, the first she'd allowed herself in years. "Mama's dead, died of fever the winter after they took me." "I know, but she made me promise. Said if ever you needed help." He trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. "You want to learn about snakes, girl? Real learning, not just watching." Over the next 3 months, Delphine found ways to slip away to the bayou edge whenever she was sent on errands. Tobias taught her everything, how to identify venomous species by their triangular heads and elliptical pupils, where they nested and hunted, how to handle them without getting bitten. He showed her that water moccasins were territorial and aggressive, that they would bite repeatedly if threatened, that their venom caused tissue death and excruciating pain. "Why you want to know all this?" Tobias asked one day, though his eyes suggested he already knew. "Maybe I just find them interesting," Delphine replied. "Maybe, or maybe you're planning something that'll get you killed, or worse, caught and sold downriver to a sugar plantation where you'll work yourself to death in 2 years." Delphine looked at him steadily. "Some things are worth dying for," Tobias sighed. "Your mama was stubborn too. Got her killed in the end." Into his bag and pulled out a pair of thick leather gloves sewn from alligator hide. "These'll keep you from getting bit when you handle them. And here," he added, producing a small clay jar, "this is sulfur. Snakes hate it. You put a line of this somewhere, they won't cross it. Helps you control where they go." "Why are you helping me?" Delphine asked. "Because I couldn't help your mama. Because I'm old and tired of watching evil men prosper while good people suffer. Because maybe, just maybe, you'll succeed where others failed." He gripped her shoulder. "But Delphine, listen to me. If you do what I think you're planning, there's no going back. They'll hunt you. They'll make an example of you. They've been making an example of me for 15 years, Delphine said softly. Time I made one of them. She began collecting snakes that very day. She found abandoned crates behind the plantation's old tobacco barn and converted them into serpent containers, boring small air holes and lining them with damp moss. Each time she was sent out for errands, firewood or water, she caught another snake. Water moccasins from the bayou's edge, copperheads from the pile of rotting logs behind the slave quarters, a massive timber rattlesnake from under the plantation house's foundation. She kept them in the hidden shed, feeding them mice she caught in the grain storage. She learned their temperaments, which ones were aggressive and which were merely defensive. She practiced handling them with Tobias's gloves until her movements became smooth and confident. The other enslaved people on the plantation began to notice her frequent trips to the bayou, her long absences. A woman named Ruth, who worked in the main house kitchen, cornered Delphine one evening behind the wash house. "What are you up to, girl?" Ruth demanded. "You're going to get yourself whipped, or worse. Marcus has been asking where you disappeared to." "I'm gathering herbs," Delphine lied, for preventing babies. "You know why I need them?" Ruth's face softened with understanding and pity. "Oh, child, that's dangerous knowledge too. They catch you with that, they'll sell you for sure." She lowered her voice. "But I understand. Lord knows I understand. You need help hiding anything, you come to me." Delphine did need help. She needed Ruth to cover for her, to make excuses when she was gone too long. She needed the other enslaved people to look the other way when she slipped into the shed, and slowly, without explicitly telling them her plan, she recruited them through their shared suffering and unspoken solidarity. Drop a comment if you've ever had to plan something in secret against all odds. The night came faster than Delphine expected, forced by Thomas's announcement at dinner one sweltering July evening. "Gentlemen, I've made a decision," Thomas declared, his voice carrying over the clink of silverware and crystal. "We're selling several pieces of our collection, including Delphine, a sugar. Plantation owner from Haiti has made an extraordinary offer. She ships out next week." Delphine stood in the corner, serving bowl in hand, and felt her blood turn to ice water. Haiti. She had heard the stories from people who had been there. The brutal conditions, life expectancy measured in months, not years, bodies worked to death and thrown in unmarked graves. This wasn't just cruelty anymore. This was a death sentence with extra steps. Marcus looked uncomfortable. "Brother, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss. The price is excellent, and frankly, she's becoming more trouble than she's worth. I caught her staring at me yesterday with such hatred in her eyes." Thomas took a long drink of wine. "Besides, we can always acquire another." The casual way he said it, as if she were a piece of furniture to be replaced, made something inside Delphine snap, not with rage or despair, but with crystalline clarity. She had 1 week, 7 days to execute a plan she had been building for 3 months, or lose everything. That night, after the Beaumont brothers had taken their turns with her and left her locked in her small room, Delphine lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear them in the study drinking and laughing. She heard Thomas mention the word exhibition and Marcus's nervous laughter. When the house finally fell silent around 2 in the morning, Delphine used the small knife she had stolen months ago, hidden in a crack in the floorboards, to work the lock on her door. It was a simple mechanism, designed to keep her in but never imagining she might pick it. Within minutes, she was free, moving through the dark house like smoke. In the kitchen, Ruth was waiting, unable to sleep. When Delphine appeared, the older woman gasped. "It's tonight, isn't it?" Ruth whispered. "Whatever you've been planning. They're selling me to Haiti. I leave in a week." Ruth closed her eyes. "Lord have mercy. Then you do what you need to do, child. I'll make sure everyone stays in their quarters, no matter what they hear." "Ruth, you could hang for helping me." "We're all hanging already," Ruth replied. "Just doing it slow. You go on now. Give them hell for all of us." Delphine made her way to the shed where her serpents waited. She had 47 snakes in total, collected over 3 months of careful hunting. The plan was simple in concept, but required perfect timing. She would need to lure both brothers to the old root cellar beneath the house, the one they never used anymore, filled with rotting vegetables and standing water, the one with only one exit. Getting them there was the easy part. She returned to the house and started a small fire in the drawing room. Nothing dangerous, just enough smoke to set off alarm. She watched from the shadows as both brothers came running, Marcus in his nightshirt, Thomas still partially dressed. They extinguished the flames quickly, cursing about careless servants and dying embers. "This plantation is falling apart," Thomas muttered. "We need to start fresh. Maybe take that Haiti money and invest in a newer property." "And the other slaves?" Marcus asked. "Sell them, all of them. Start over with a younger workforce." That was all Delphine needed to hear. They weren't just monsters to her, they were monsters to everyone enslaved here. This wasn't just personal revenge anymore. This was justice. She waited until they headed back toward their bedrooms, then made a sound in the hallway, a deliberate scrape of wood on wood. Thomas turned. "Who's there?" Delphine appeared at the end of the hall, deliberately visible in her thin nightdress. "Master Thomas, please. I heard what you said. About selling everyone. Please let me talk to you, both of you. I can make it worth your while." The brothers exchanged glances. Whatever they saw in her posture, they interpreted as submission, desperation, seduction. They followed her down the stairs, through the kitchen to the door leading to the root cellar. "Down here?" Marcus sounded skeptical. "No one will hear us down here," Delphine said softly. "I want to show you both something. Something I've been saving. Please." Pride and lust overcame caution. They descended the wooden stairs into the damp darkness. Delphine followed, carrying an oil lamp. At the bottom, she turned to face them. "What is this about, girl?" Thomas demanded. "This," Delphine said, and smashed the lamp against the stairs. Fire erupted, cutting off the exit. In the sudden chaos and light, the brothers didn't see Delphine open the first crate she had positioned in the cellar hours earlier. Didn't see her dump the cottonmouths onto the floor, followed by the copperheads, followed by the water moccasins she had starved for 2 days to make them aggressive. By the time they realized what was happening, Delphine was already climbing the support beam she had prepared, pulling herself up to a small ledge near the ceiling, well above the writhing mass of serpents below. The first bite came within seconds. Marcus screamed. Thomas tried to climb the stairs, but the flames drove him back. Delphine watched from above as the snakes, disturbed and angry, struck again and again. What would you do in Delphine's position? Let us know in the comments. The brothers' screams echoed through the cellar for hours, but the thick walls and isolated location meant no one heard them clearly. Ruth had done her job well, keeping the other enslaved people in their quarters, spreading word that the masters were entertaining guests and weren't to be disturbed. Delphine remained on her ledge, watching. The fire on the stairs had burned itself out quickly, leaving only smoke and char. But it had served its purpose, preventing escape in those crucial first minutes when the brothers might have had a chance. Now they were trapped below with 47 venomous snakes, and the creatures were doing what nature had designed them to do. Water moccasins, Tobias had taught her, inject hemotoxic venom that destroys blood vessels and tissue. A single bite causes agonizing pain, swelling, and potential tissue death. Multiple bites exponentially increase the damage and suffering. These weren't quick deaths. They were slow, excruciating, and utterly without mercy. Thomas Beaumont died first, around 3 in the morning. He had been bitten at least 20 times, his body swollen and discolored, his screams having faded to whimpers hours before. Marcus lasted longer, perhaps because he had tried to stay still to avoid provoking more strikes. But the snakes were everywhere in the confined space, and his stillness only prolonged his suffering. As she watched them die, Delphine felt no joy, no satisfaction, just a cold, hollow emptiness where her humanity had once been. They had taken everything from her childhood, her body, her future, her very sense of self. She had become what they made her, a weapon forged in the fire of their cruelty. When Marcus finally stopped breathing, just as dawn light began filtering through the high cellar windows, Delphine climbed down from her perch. The snakes, exhausted from their night of violence, were now sluggish, some coiled in corners, others still moving slowly across the floor. Using Tobias's techniques, she carefully collected them back into their crates, one by one. Her hands were steady. She felt nothing. Then came the hardest part of her plan, the part she had thought about least because it required the most faith. She climbed the stairs, pushed open the cellar door, and walked straight to the slave quarters where Ruth was waiting with 15 other enslaved people, everyone who remained on the Beaumont plantation. "It's done," Delphine said simply. Ruth studied her face, then nodded. "And now? Now we decide together. I killed them. That makes me a murderer in the eyes of the law. They'll hunt me. They'll probably assume all of you helped, even though you didn't. We have maybe 2 days before someone notices they're missing and comes investigating." A man named Samuel, who worked as the plantation's blacksmith, spoke up. "We could run. Head north. There are routes. People who help." "Some of us could make it," agreed a young woman named Grace. "But some of us are too old, too young, too sick to travel fast, and they'll have dogs, horses, guns." "There's another option," Ruth said quietly. Everyone turned to her. "We tell the truth, or at least a version of it." "What version?" Delphine asked. "That you were defending yourself, that Thomas attacked you, Marcus tried to stop you from defending yourself, that there was a struggle, and they fell into the cellar where the snakes were, an accident, a tragedy." Ruth's eyes were steady. "Camille Beaumont hates her husband's brothers. Everyone in town knows it. They humiliated her, flaunted you in front of her guests. She might back that story just to avoid scandal. It was a desperate gamble, relying on a white woman's wounded pride and desire to avoid embarrassment to save an enslaved woman who had just killed 2 white men." But as Delphine looked around at the faces of the people whose lives depended on what happened next, she realized she owed them the truth. "I need to tell you all something," she began, "about why they kept me the way they did, about who I am." She explained everything, her intersex condition that the Beaumont brothers had fetishized and exploited, how they had bought her specifically because of it, how they had displayed her like a curiosity, used her body for their pleasure and their guests' entertainment. Some people looked shocked, others just looked sad, but no one looked at her with disgust, only with understanding and rage at what had been done to her. "They made you a thing," Samuel said finally. "Not a person, a thing." And then they wondered why the thing bit back. "We stand with you," Grace added, "whatever comes. We tell your story, the real one, what they did, what you had to do to survive." When Camille Beaumont was finally roused at noon and told her brothers-in-law were missing, she found Delphine waiting in the drawing room, clean and calm, with Ruth and Samuel beside her. What was said in that room was never recorded in any official documents. But 3 hours later, the local sheriff arrived to investigate a terrible accident in which 2 gentlemen had apparently fallen into a cellar while investigating a fire where they were tragically bitten by snakes that had nested in the abandoned space. The story was implausible to anyone who thought about it carefully, but it was also convenient. It avoided scandal. It meant the Beaumont estate could be quietly sold without the taint of something worse, and it allowed Camille to paint herself as a gracious woman who chose not to punish the slaves who had tried to warn her brothers-in-law about the danger. Could you make such a calculated decision? Tell us in the comments below. 6 months later, Delphine stood on a dock in New Orleans, watching ships unload cargo and passengers. She was free now, truly free, with papers that declared her a liberated person. The Beaumont plantation had been sold, and Camille had kept her word, arranging for all the enslaved people there to be given their freedom as part of the estate settlement. It was unprecedented, suspicious, but legal. Ruth stood beside her, along with Grace and Samuel. They had become a family of sorts, bound by what they had survived and what they had done to survive it. Some of the others had gone north to start new lives. A few had even gone west, seeking land and opportunity in territories where their pasts might not follow them. But Delphine had stayed in Louisiana, working with Tobias, who was teaching her his trade. She caught snakes now for leather merchants and doctors, making an honest living from the creatures that had once been her instruments of revenge. The work was dangerous, but she found she liked the honesty of snakes. They struck when threatened, killed to eat or defend themselves, but never for cruelty's sake. They were more honest than any human she had known. "You think about them?" Ruth asked quietly, knowing without asking who them was. "Every day," Delphine admitted, "but not with regret. With wonder that I survived, that we all survived." "You know people are telling stories about you," Samuel said, "about the woman who tamed as serpents and made them her army. They're calling you the serpent saint, the snake witch, making you into a legend." "I'm no saint," Delphine replied. "I'm just someone who refused to die quietly." "That's worth being a legend for," Grace said softly. The truth was more complicated than legend would ever capture. Delphine had committed murder. That was undeniable. But she had also survived 15 years of sexual slavery, of being treated as an object rather than a person, of having her body violated and displayed for the entertainment of evil men. The law would have said she had no right to revenge, but Delphine had learned there was a higher law than what was written in books, the law of survival, of resistance, of refusing to let cruelty be the last word. 3 years later, when the Civil War began and enslaved people across the South began their own forms of resistance, some would remember the story of Delphine and her serpents. It would be told in hushed voices around fires, in the language of hope and warning. It would be embroidered and changed, made more dramatic and less brutal, turned into folklore where the woman became a goddess and the snakes became divine punishment. But those who knew the truth, Ruth and Samuel and Grace and the others, they kept the real story alive too. The story of a woman who was victimized but refused to remain a victim, who planned carefully and acted decisively, who saved not just herself, but the entire community of people who had suffered alongside her. In 1849, Delphine used her savings to buy a small plot of land along the bayou. She built a house there, raised chickens and grew vegetables, continued catching snakes for a living. Ruth and Grace came to live with her, and Samuel built his blacksmith shop nearby. They created their own small community of freed people, looked after each other, helped others escape north when they could. Delphine never married, never had children, but she taught other women her trade, showed them how to survive in a world that wanted to consume them. She taught them that monsters could be defeated, that even the most powerless person could find power if they were patient and clever and willing to do what was necessary. When she died in 1879 at the age of 60, her funeral was attended by over 200 people, freed blacks and sympathetic whites, people whose lives she had touched and saved. They buried her near the bayou she had loved, under a cypress tree where water, moccasins still nested in the roots. On her gravestone, they carved a simple epitaph that told the truth in a way only those who knew her story would understand. She made peace with serpents and war with devils. The serpents were kinder. Years later, historians would debate whether Delphine's story was real or legend. Some would dismiss it as folklore, impossible in its details. Others would find documentation, the sale records of the Beaumont plantation, the suspicious death certificates of 2 brothers, the unusually large number of freed slaves from a single estate. They would argue about morality and justice, about whether revenge could ever be righteous, about whether violence in response to violence was liberation or simply more violence. But in the communities that remembered her, in the stories passed down through generations, Delphine was always remembered as she was, human, flawed, traumatized, but ultimately triumphant. A woman who had been treated as less than human and, who had reclaimed her humanity through an act of brutal resistance. The serpents had been her teachers, showing her that survival sometimes requires venom, that defending yourself is not the same as being cruel, that even the most seemingly powerless creature can be deadly when cornered. She had learned her lessons well, and in the end, she had survived. They had not. That was justice enough. Thank you for following Delphine's story to its end. Share your thoughts on her journey in the comments, and subscribe to hear more untold stories of resistance and survival from history's shadows. These stories matter because they remind us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit finds ways to fight back and reclaim its freedom.